Hello again everyone, this is the second video, this time looking at how to write your explorations. Having had a look at some of the work that you've handed in to me, I think it's fair to say there's some common mistakes being made, so it's worth just having a quick look through the checklist again together and looking at some of the examples and where you can draw some inspiration from those examples. Okay, so looking at the checklist first of all, and the assessment criteria, you can see that this is worth 4 marks, this section. So not a huge amount of marks for this, but again, quite difficult to get those 4 marks if you don't ensure that each part of that assessment criteria is well explained in your response. So it looks fairly simple on the face of it. Research design explained, sampling and choice of participants explained, materials and variables explained, but actually doing that is quite difficult. So just to run you through the checklist again, firstly, looking at the design you've used, independent samples or repeated measures. In your case, doing a Loftus and Palmer experiment, you're going to be using independent samples, aren't you? Because you're going to have 2 different groups doing the 2 different verbs. Explain how that design was organised and why you chose that design. So in other words, what are the strengths of using independent samples? Why did you choose to do that rather than say repeated measures? And that's what you need to explain. What are the benefits of doing that over the other? Then we've got participant allocation to conditions. So some of you have mentioned about random allocation. That's spot on, but you need to say why and how. What is random allocation? What does it involve? So just a little bit of detail, just a sentence or two, just to spell out exactly what it is that you have done to use random allocation. Ethics, I think that should be straightforward really. So the usual sorts of issues, ensuring informed consent, ensuring anonymity, debriefing at the end to explain what that was all about, to ensure there's no deception. Those are the sorts of things that you need to be explaining. Then we get to the sampling technique. So what technique did you use? How did you get this group of 20 participants together? To just say it was opportunity sampling is going to be too brief. You need to say exactly what that is and why did you do that? Why did you use opportunity sampling? Describe the population. It would be enough to just say a school in Kent in England. That's fine. We need to say that we used exactly 20 people at least, if that's how many you did use, and what was the makeup of that group as well. So how many males, how many females, what was the age range? Be precise as possible. Your materials and procedure will go in this as well, so that should be already done, so that just slots in towards the end. And describe the controls that you've used. So what were the potential confounding variables in this experiment? What could have caused a problem with your findings and how did you address them? That should be very, very well explained. I want to see a clear variable identified, what could have affected your findings and what did you do to ensure that that did not happen or was reduced as best as possible at least. Okay, so looking through the first few points then, the design that you've used and why, and explaining why you choose one over the other. Let's just have a look at an example. This is an example of a replication of Bailey's experiment of word length. Very simple experiment about how well we can remember longer words compared to shorter words. Anyway, the structure of this is what's important. You can see in the yellow, I've identified where they've explained the use of design. So they used repeated measures and they said why. They said what benefit that has, specifically how that has benefits compared to say independent samples design. You can see within this as well in the different colour there, I've identified the controls that we use. So this person decided to identify confounding variables and the controls throughout their piece, and they linked that to the issues they were writing about. You could choose to do your control of variables section at the end if you find that a bit easier, but this person chose to talk about them as they explained the parts of their exploration. You can see at the bottom as well, I've highlighted random allocation has been used there. That's too brief. Ideally, that should be explained. How exactly was random allocation used? So was it a case of drawing names out of a hat, for example? Just a sentence or two to explain how that was done. But otherwise, a very good example for you to use. Just looking at the Loftus and Palmer example that I gave to you, you can see the difference. This one is very, very brief. They've said that they used independent group design, but they haven't said why. They haven't said why they chose to do that rather than repeated measures, for example. So you can see that one would be far, far too brief. You would need to include the level and detail of explanation that we can see in this example instead. Okay, looking at ethics, again, I think this is a more straightforward one. You can see here, they've only mentioned this quite briefly in this example. Parental and student consent was obtained, debriefed, anonymity. I would say that's probably too brief, in fact. If I was being very critical, I'd want to see slightly more on that. And looking at this Loftus and Palmer example, you can see actually they've done this very well, I think. They've identified the issue, but then explained how they would deal with it as well. So participants were shown, or told they would be shown a video involving two cars. That avoids deception. I think that's quite a nice way of laying it out, because they've specified the issue and how they've addressed those ethical concerns. Moving on to the sampling part, this is probably the detailed part of it. Identify the technique, describe the sample you used, how many people, and what was the makeup of your sample. If we look at this experiment again, the Begley experiment and this exemplar, you can see here that I've highlighted the fact that they used an opportunity sample, but ideally that would be explained. What is an opportunity sample and why was that used? You can see I've also highlighted the makeup of the group. So high school students in an international school, 14 were male, 6 had English as their mother tongue, age range 14 to 15, and importantly, they've talked about familiarity with the materials there as well. So just take time to pause this and read that carefully, because they've explained the fact that the words they've used, the students would be familiar with. Now, the age range of participants you've used, could you perhaps comment upon how familiar they would be with driving, for example? If you've used 17 to 18-year-olds that have started their driving tests, or their lessons at least, could you therefore say they perhaps would have a better idea of an estimated speed? Perhaps that is an issue in your research that you need to consider. Perhaps it would be a confounding variable if you've used students who have not started driving lessons, maybe have got no real idea about speed estimates. Just something for you to think about, and especially when thinking about your sample. Are you going to have a mix of people familiar or unfamiliar with driving, or are you going to try and keep it quite similar? Looking at this example from Loftus and Palmer experiment, you can see they've done the same, but again, just slightly less detailed. They've said who they've chosen, so 10 male, 10 female. It'd be better though if they'd explained exactly why they've chosen these certain students. They have mentioned that they've tried to reduce demand characteristics by not using any psychology students. Very, very good point. I would suggest that you do something similar. Don't use psychology students, because otherwise they are going to know this experiment. Just looking at procedure and materials, I think I'll just skip past this because you have already written up your procedure and materials. It should be the same for each person within one group. So within your group, you should have the same procedure and materials that you're just going to slot into your piece. Here, they've incorporated their procedure and materials into the body of their text. So they've just outlined there the experiment and what they did. In this experiment, they've done the same for Loftus and Palmer. They've incorporated it into the writing. I think it's best to keep it separate, have subheadings, materials and procedures as you've already written it, and just put it towards the end of your piece, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The last thing then is the confounding variables and the control of them. So what did you do to identify confounding variables, and how did you control them? You can see in this example, as I've said before, they've tried to incorporate that into their writing as they've gone, so it isn't a separate section, it's just included throughout. They've mentioned things like having different lists in their experiment, so that there's no practice effect in repeated measures. They've eliminated participant variability, so tried to make sure that actually the groups were fairly similar in memory. Yours are obviously going to be different. These are specific to this research, but these are the sorts of things you should be thinking about. What could influence the results, and have I taken steps to ensure that that doesn't happen? They also said they used a pilot study, so a test run through of this experiment. Will you do the same, or have you done the same? That's an important thing to think about as well. I would suggest that you do a pilot study just to see how well this works in practice before you launch into the actual experiment. Looking at Loftus and Palmer, you can see this is very, very short. This would not be enough by any stretch. All participants were in the same room, watching the same film. Yes, but you should also be talking about standardized use of instructions as well, so there's no confusion about what's being asked. There's no researcher bias by giving different instructions to different groups. You're going to keep yours exactly the same. These are the sorts of issues that you should be including. And of course, the fact that you've controlled variables by looking at the sample that you've chosen as well. This is the example I gave you of an exploration from a Sparrow replication. So if you remember Sparrow's use of technology or memory, I'm showing you this because I think the layout of this is what you should be imitating really. We should have the materials and the procedure laid out as you've already done them right at the end, and then really just going through the questions on the checklist in order to make sure that you've hit all points. You can see the very first line here. The experiment was conducted with an independent samples design. So yours will say the same. However, they haven't then gone on to explain what independent samples is. Why did they use that? Why did they not use repeated measures? So the structure of this I like, but this would only achieve 2 out of 4 marks. There is a lack of detail running through this where they've not explained some of those key points properly. They've said an opportunity sample was used primarily due to convenience. Well, they haven't said what an opportunity sample is. That is missing there. Some of the control of variables as well are not very fully explained. There's not really much on ethics either. So there is certainly missing bits in this. I just wanted to show it to you though, because it's a good way of laying out your research. Just come back finally then to the checklist. Really, as long as you make sure you've done those 10 things, then your exploration should be good to go. Just keep coming back to this though, please, and check in. Have I done each part of this? Some of it you're going to find difficult to do because you haven't done the experiment just yet, but don't worry about that. I want you to do as much of it as you can, trying to ensure you've included all 10 points. If you have any questions, please do send me an email, but hopefully looking through those examples and those 10 points, you can see exactly what is being expected of you.